The Minuteman Algorithm. Suppose that a code existed that was known only to the initiated, a hidden algorithm that defined exchange rate volatility and the parameters of stock market derivatives. What then would be the value of wealth and the civilization we live in? And what would be the value of our social system and social consensus? What if an algorithm cryptographically defined the randomness of everyday life? What then would be the identifiers for happiness and fate, success and failure in such a world? And what if this code was not of divine origin but man-made? If heaven and hell were earthly, and the rise and fall of nations were just a game in a sandbox that the hegemon created for the players? What task would the Messiah have in such a world? And would he who were to finish the game be the Messiah or his antithesis? This is the story of a few of the players. Dedicated to the patient. Good afternoon, Monsieur Le Bon. A good day to you too, Monsieur Joly. How long has the patient been in a persistent vegetative state? I think since the mid-80s. And the patient is still alive? Yes, Maurice. The brain is still wholly intact, as are the organs. But, Gustave, why doesn't the patient wake up? It seems that the patient is aware of everything that happens around him, but for some reason prefers to flee from reality. I understand, Gustave. This is tragic, very tragic, but also not bad, because then we can openly talk while we play. All right, Maurice, let's get the patient to the table and let him watch our game. Prologue. Rasputin's book circle was located on Store Street, a side street in the Fitzrovia district, in one of those typical London buildings. 3-story blocks of houses with stores in the basement, separated by large white pilasters. Above a whitewashed cornice that runs the length of the building, they feature a clinker facade in tinges of muted dark red, filthy black and washed-out grey. The shop window, resting on a grey-painted, coffered pedestal, and the grey-framed glass entrance door offered a view into a space lined with overflowing bookshelves, crammed with display tables, showcases, and open cardboard boxes, the room narrowing toward the back like a tube. A torrential downpour was pounding, staccato fashion, on the grey awning spanning the entrance of number 33 and cascading onto the orange-grey sidewalk slabs. Just about made it, sighed Kimberly with relief, after she had rescued the last of the books from the large exhibition table that stood in front of the store window as an eye-catcher to entice walk-in customers to enter the store. Exhausted, she let herself drop onto the worn velvet cushion of the neo-baroque couch that filled the niche diagonally opposite the sales counter. This was her refuge, to where she could retreat when she was alone in the store, to catch her breath, or to become immersed in reading one of the countless books she was surrounded by all day long. Kimberly was one of those red-haired, pale, blue-eyed, freckled, typically Celtic-looking women who aptly personified the witch prototype according to tradition. Whenever she leafed through one of the books on devil worship and witchcraft, she imagined, with a mixture of horror and comfort, that, solely because of her appearance, she would undoubtedly have been burned at the stake in the Middle Ages. Even though she was known as a specialist in medieval history and mythology, and had made a name for herself as an expert in the field of heretic inquisition and witch trials, Kimberly kept her distance from the new witch culture movement, whose representatives regularly met for readings and sessions in her bookstore. She certainly had feelings of admiration for the self-confidence of these women who called themselves young urban witches and who practiced, without any reservation, satanic rituals which they then wrote about in texts full of emotion. Still, in her mid-40s, Kimberly preferred the scientist's distance view of the phenomenon of witchcraft. Even if she sometimes deviated from cold analysis and, in her imagination, gave in to confusing reveries about her witch-like nature, she always did so in secret and on her own, and her transgressions went unnoticed by the outside world. Kimberly let the pentacle-patterned blanket slide off her shoulders and played with the idea of brewing a cup of tea when the store bell rang frantically and startled her from her comfortable break. It was a young man who came crashing in through the front door, backward, heaving in a large cardboard box, much of which was already soaked. He is seeking shelter from the rain, she thought, and stood waiting behind the counter. She watched as the young man, swaying under the load despite his ecoskeleton, moved toward her, barely avoiding collisions with the tables. His rockabilly hair, which was excessively coiffed with hair wax, was perfectly styled and had remained unruffled despite being drenched by the rain. He wore a Lonsdale t-shirt that wetly clung to his belt and 501 jeans over ankle-high poncho boots. They were the kind of boots whose tips looked like they had been chopped off. Kimberly's delicate nose picked up the smell of stale beer, which intensified as the young man approached. He slammed the carton onto the counter, and his alcohol-laden breath blew directly into her face. "Good morning," he grumbled with a strong Cockney accent. "I have ancient books here that deal with all kinds of hocus-pocus." He was evidently wearing a display contact lens for the partially blind, which had increasingly replaced smart glasses in recent years. It gave his gaze a touch of grotesque distortion. Kimberly believed she could see lust in those eyes, and instinctively flinched a little. "Don't you come near me, you poisoned dwarf," she thought with a slight hint of disgust. "The RFID chip and eyelid interface can't connect, so I had to carry these books without the aid of the ecoskeleton," the young man explained, affably, pointing to the strapped-in power loader usually used by people who worked in the moving industry. "Good morning," Kimberly replied. "We don't usually buy used books. We only broker them, if at all." She pointed her chin in the direction of the box and continued, "And only if they are not soaked from the rain." She paused briefly, then casually moved her pale hand to indicate a semicircle. "Take a look around. Our range comprises high-quality books from the occult only." The young man looked around and stepped up to one of the shelves. "Scarlet Imprints? Is that a brand or a series?" he asked. Kimberly imperceptibly turned up her nose. She was sure that since the man could not connect his RFID chip to the lens, he could barely decipher the book titles. "This is a publisher of special quality," she replied, "whose books are individually designed and elaborately crafted." The young man pulled one of the volumes from the shelf and examined it with fascination. "I don't happen to read books," he remarked, and pushed the book back into the shelf. "The experiences of others are of little interest to me. I prefer to experience and collect my own. I am a guild leader in Hollow he stated proudly. "Hollow the multi-massive online existence?" Kimberly asked, interested. "I work half days at a moving company, and the rest of the day I'm an armourer in Hollow the young man replied. "But I'm thinking of giving up my moving job because I earn more in Hollow I am now the guild's armourer and can make a good living from it. The weapons I produce for the game, I sell to my guild at a large profit, and as a guild leader, I hold a high position in the game." He grinned. "That means a lot of cryptos for petty cash," he added mischievously. Kimberly let him talk. She was sure that Rockabilly was spending his money in slot machines, which would fit his profile. The exact traceability of cryptocurrencies via the private blockchain IP by search engine algorithms would undoubtedly keep leading him to the slot machines. "Which is where they will take everything from you again, you loser," she thought mockingly. "Hollow now has 500 million players and not a single competitor. Thus, my income is secured. I even pay into Hollow pension insurance," the boy continued. "It's pointless to deal with books. They have no added value. As the saying goes, there is no other world. Come to Hollow Kimberly smiled. "I have to disappoint you. Unfortunately, you must take your books back with you. As I said, we do not generally buy used editions. Try the flea market." "After I analysed the carton contents through the display contact lens, the search engine led me to you." The young man did not let up. "Really?" Kimberly asked in surprise, and for the first time her voice sounded a little interested. "Where did you get that box of books?" The ringing of the shop doorbell interrupted their conversation. a tall customer with long, braided, mostly grey hair and a parietal lobe interface, leaning on a gnarled ebony stick, shook the raindrops from the rubberized black cotton fabric of his klepper coat and entered. When the rockabilly saw the customer, he instinctively took a few steps back. "Transhumanist cyborg," he murmured, half in fear, half in admiration. The customer consciously ignored the much shorter other man and walked straight toward Kimberly. The rockabilly said casually, "I'll come back again tonight, and if you want to buy the books, we'll make a deal. If not, I'll take them back," and staggered to the exit before Kimberly could reply. The area around the counter smelled like beer. "Great," Kimberly thought. "Now I have a crate of flea market books around my neck." She would have loved to have given the box straight back to that strange young man. "Doctor, good morning," she addressed the new customer. The doctor seemed more like a junkie, but everyone who knew him called him Doctor because he liked to lecture on all aspects of Celticism. The customer approached the terminal, located in the corner behind the counter, and connected his parietal lobe interface to the database to search for a book in the catalogue lists. Meanwhile, Kimberly was struggling to move the box to the right corner of the counter, and her face clearly showed her annoyance at this hassle. The doctor turned to the saleswoman and tapped his gnarled stick twice on the floor. Kimberly jumped up and looked at him questioningly. "I'm looking for an old work in German, an encyclopedia in 12 volumes entitled Das Kloster by Johann Schiebel." His bass voice boomed. "I have found nothing on the web. Do you have any idea where we could obtain this work, Mrs. Morrigan?" "You didn't find anything in the antiquarian database either?" "No," answered the man. "I'll have a look for you, Doctor. Do you have the search words?" "Start with the title, Mrs. Morrigan. The Monastery. Secular and spiritual, and search beyond that for the keywords Faustian Pact and Faustian Magic. You do speak German." Kimberly connected her RFID chip to the eyelid interface and checked the database hologram. According to the German database system, it is a work that Johann Schiebel published in 1845 in small numbers, just one edition, she explained. Faustian Magic and the Faustian Pact with Mephistopheles, the story of Faust in rhyme, based on the only known copy from 1587 in the Royal Library in Copenhagen. While she continued to search for the book in the database, the tall man looked around the store and noticed the half-open cardboard box at the end of the counter. "May I have a look at the books in the box, Mrs. Morrigan?" he asked with interest. "Yes, of course," mumbled Kimberly, absent-mindedly, without interrupting her search. The doctor opened the box. Immediately, an elegantly designed, voluminous book bound in snakeskin caught his eye. He read the title, The Game of Saturn, and continued to rummage. Then he took out another book and read the author's name, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Netzheim. "The book you are looking for contains sigilles," Kimberly spoke up again, "and the key to the pact. In any case, 2 of the volumes of the encyclopedia are relevant with regard to Faust." She looked at the doctor, shrugged her shoulders apologetically, and added, "The library version of the Prussian State Library is only accessible to registered scholars." The doctor appeared to be only half listening. "What are all these books here, Mrs. Morrigan?" he inquired. "I would like to purchase a few of the volumes from this box." Kimberly looked up, bewildered. "These are flea market books." "What do you want for the whole box?" The doctor's bass boomed questioningly. Irritated, Kimberly pushed her glasses on her forehead and said, "These books are not for sale for the time being. They do not belong to us." "Look what I found in the box, Mrs. Morrigan," said the doctor, staring at Kimberly with a strange look. "The Monastery, volume 1 to 4. Kimberly took the book out of his hand and slowly and carefully read the title embossed in Old German Frankter script, translating from the German. Johann Schiebel, Dr. Johann Faust. I, Faust and his predecessors, Faust's Compulsion of Hell, Jesuiterum Libellus, or The Mighty Sea Spirit, Book of Miracles, Art and Wonders, The Key to the Compulsion of Hell. Then she looked expectantly at the doctor and said, "You, doctor, are quite proficient in German too." She slammed the book shut, blew some dust off the edges and added with a hint of astonishment in her voice, "And this is the book you were looking for?" Kimberly began to examine the contents of the box more closely. "These books are worth a fortune. They are not even available in antiquarian stores anymore," she remarked, astounded. They both rummaged through the box. "Here, look at this book, doctor. It is handwritten on parchment. The writing looks Aramaic." "No, Mrs. Morrigan," the man dryly contradicted. "It is Chaldean, and this one is—" The doctor stopped, then continued in amazement. "This here is a copy of the Greek magical papyri in ancient Greek, Coptic and Demotic." The two bibliophilic treasure hunters placed all the volumes on the counter, flabbergasted. The doctor gasped with excitement and took off his coat. Kimberly wrung her hands, oblivious of her thoughts, red spots appearing on her pale face. "What do we do now, Mrs. Morrigan?" asked the doctor. "We must contact the owner, the young man with the ecoskeleton from earlier. Where did he get those books?" "I didn't ask him," Kimberly apologized. "Well then," the doctor commenced, "he is not here, but we should find a solution. I will give you £2,000 for the volume of the monastery, Mrs. Morrigan." "I cannot give you this book," Kimberly warded him off. "I have not acquired these books yet. Come back tomorrow." "Surely you don't think I would give up this treasure and go home without a single volume," the doctor exclaimed. "I'll give you a down payment of £3,000. No, £5,000 for it, Mrs. Morrigan, and you will make a deal with the young man." "You know it is not right for me to promise anything to you before I have bought the young man's books." £5,000 at once," the doctor barked with a wicked expression on his face. "What's pay transfer?" he decreed and activated his payment system. "Tomorrow we'll close the deal," he added calmly, wrapped himself in his coat and reached for the volume of the monastery. "I'll take this with me today." "Ah, you persuaded me." Kimberly sighed and took her hand off the cover. "Tonight I'm going to settle with the young man." She looked at her counterpart questioningly. £5,000? The doctor nodded affirmatively and completed the payment process via his interface. Then he jammed the book under his arm, gave a curt bow, and knocked his gnarled stick on the floor 3 times as a farewell gesture. After the glass door had closed with the chime of the bells, Kimberly looked at the volumes and bundles of manuscripts lined up on the counter. Lovingly, she stroked the patina of the bindings and absorbed the scent of centuries of scholarship. From under the counter, she pulled out an undamaged cardboard box and began to unwrap the books wistfully. Luckily, the prints remain dry, she thought. Only the manuscripts have gotten damp. She carefully stacked the volumes on top of each other. Kimberly placed the manuscripts on top and left the covers open so that the damp pages could breathe. She took a bundle of corrugated unbleached paper that was soaked in several places to lay it out temporarily to dry. Carefully, she separated the stuck-together front sheets and turned over the first page, from which a more extensive piece had torn off. The tight, regular handwriting immediately caught her attention. "Florentine Bastarda," she murmured and examined the page more closely. The rainwater had made the black ink run together and rendered part of the writing illegible. "This is English," she marvelled as she deciphered the legible fragments. "Modern English." She excitedly turned over more pages and shook her head several times in disbelief. Who would nowadays use a medieval chancery script to write a diary? She asked herself. It seemed to be a diary or a report or something similar, but unfortunately it was incomplete in places. Some pages were missing. On others, the writing was hardly decipherable. Kimberly was pleased that not many customers were likely to visit on this rainy Friday afternoon, and that she had enough time for undisturbed browsing before the young man would return. She put down the manuscript and went to the teapot. Finally, she had the opportunity to prepare her beloved Nepalese Highland tea, a ceremony Kimberly performed full of eager anticipation of the pleasures to follow. She carefully allowed the dark green first flush leaves with the golden yellow tint to trickle into the exquisite china pot, and, smiling serenely, picked up the single leaf that had fallen on the tabletop with her moistened fingertip to grind it between her teeth with relish. This wonderfully aromatic vintage from a hidden plantation on the southern slopes of the Kanchenjunga in the Ilam district, an insider tip from connoisseurs, had been given to her by one of the young witches who had been on a pilgrimage to the Devi temples of the Himalayas. When the water boiled, she counted to 30, and only then did she pour it because she was convinced that the tea worked best when the water was slightly below boiling point. Balancing the tea set on a tray, she retreated to her niche and sank into the velvety cushions of the couch. Kimberly poured the tea from the pot into the cup in a gentle arc, pulled her knees up and sipped the steaming brew with delight. Then she opened the manuscript and began to read the much-torn first page. Ave Sorores, un fra. Here now follows my report for the Zikkurat, which I have made available to the egregor. It is a further confirmation of the oracle's prediction about which we must expect. To change the course of the probabilities, we must explicitly point out the reason is that the error delta mentioned in my story cannot be calculated by the or. The oracle must adjust the variables to that effect, and this error delta will trigger a quantum leap effect which will make the mechanism and our vocation obsolete. There is still enough time to neutralize the error delta to steer our plan for Homo sapiens in the right direction. I have described my narrative of the events exactly in the way I experienced them, the transmission of the oracle as a gain in knowledge. The rest of the text was missing. The next pages were also missing. Kimberly took another sip of Nepalese tea, placed a thick pillow on the sidearm of the sofa, which was decorated with a black lion's head, and lay down in a comfortable position. She read on. Remembered that I was in Warsaw. I had left Kiev and had travelled by land to Poland. I know that in Kiev I attended a concert by the heavy metal band Warlock, and there I heard the song, All We Are. I still remember the concert poster displaying an alligator. At the Kiev bus station, I bought a bottle of water. How I got on the bus and what happened on the trip, I do not remember. The last thing I remember is that I was in an intensely psychedelic state in Warsaw when I turned toward 2 employees of a private security company. Afterward, I woke up in a hospital, fixed to a bed, in a cramped 6-bed room. Some of the other patients were also tied to the bed, but not all of them. One of them talked incessantly in an idiom that sounded like a mixture of different Eastern European languages. I did not understand what the man was talking about, but his endless monologue was composed of at least 6 different languages. The other patients seemed to be under powerful medication, as they were staring lethargically into space, drooling with their mouths open. It was an eerie place. 3 of the inmates did not seem to be locals. They reminded me of Western Europeans. One of them approached me, looking confused, and addressed me in English in a hounded voice. "Welcome to purgatory. All I remember is drinking a devil's cocktail in Vienna," he shouted, adding with a shrug. "And then I woke up here. At some point, I can't remember when, weeks, months ago." He cried and held his head with both hands. "We'll never get out of here," he yelled. "Where are we?" I asked. "It seems to be Poland. I once heard the nurses whispering in Polish," he replied, with a convulsive twitch on his face. "But where? I don't know. There's no possibility of communication with the outside world here. They put something into our drinking water, but if you do not drink for 3 days, your mind becomes clear again. Then all that takes effect is the medication. They tap into our brains. None of the men and women is actually sick. About 20 people are here. They do not tell us anything, but they keep us quiet so they can run experiments with us. 2 of the doctors speak English with a slight Eastern European accent, and one speaks perfect English." "What does the piercing voice of our roommate constantly tell us?" I asked. "I don't know that either," replied the man who looked down on me from the edge of the bed. "There are 2 doctors here, Dr. Lomer, the head physician," he flinched when he mentioned the name, "and his assistant, Dr. Ilse Anschutz. They have German names, but they are not German." He rolled his eyes and his drool dripped on my chest. His face bright red, he continued croaking. "The real Dr. Lomer was a German occultist, an ariosophist." Suddenly tired, he added, "Dr. Anschutz constantly records everything, like a reporter, as if she were recording and commenting on everything that is filmed." I contemplated that this place where I had found myself had to be related to my Ukrainian experiences, and the fact that an occultist and ariosophist was in command here gave me a premonition of how the events would develop. When a gigantic orderly entered the room, the English-speaking patient immediately fled back into the corner to get as far away as possible. My shackles were released. The orderly gestured for me to leave the bed and follow him. I caught a glimpse from the barred window. The surroundings looked like a jungle. If it were supposed to be Poland, it would have to be somewhere in the country's east. The last primeval forests of Europe, I thought to myself. Outside in the hallway, patients were standing around lethargically. This is a prison. The thought went through my mind. We walked down a semi-dark corridor, dimly lit with cold neon light. The dark green walls depressed the mood. A woman's voice was ringing from one of the rooms, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. It seemed as if someone was screaming their vocal cords out of their throat. There was an arrow pointing upward on the door. No, it was not an arrow. It was a rune. It was the Tyre rune, which stands for justice in the older Futhark, the Germanic first row of runes. All the other doors leading out into the corridor were marked with runes as well. The orderly told me to wait outside the door with the rune of justice. A mixture of cries of pain and music filtered through to the outside. I could hear the voluminous soprano of Maria Callas. An aria from the magic flute ended at an exaggerated volume and began again. The orderly opened the door and looked inside the room. I was able to look inside too. Extremely bright, rhythmic flashes of light flickered through the room. A woman was tied to an armchair and her head was fixed. Water dripped from a height of about 3 meters onto the woman's half-shaved head from the ceiling. Also, water was forced into her through a hose that was stuck in her mouth. I could see that she had wet herself. After a few seconds, the orderly closed the door again and placed a red line on a chart affixed to the door frame. I counted, and it was the 6th line. I assumed that they represented days. The orderly told me to go ahead. At the door at the end of the corridor, I saw the rune Hagalaz, the rune of destruction. I wondered where I could be because what I saw did not quite make sense. Why would old Nordic rune symbols be used in a hospital or prison in Poland, and people tortured psychologically and physically? It seemed surreal. There were cameras everywhere, monitoring the entire hospital wing. The orderly opened the door, and we entered the room, which had only the most basic furniture. Sitting at a desk was a man in his 60s with a moustache, looking at me over his gold-rimmed glasses. His appearance seemed authoritarian. The rubbed brass sign on the edge of his desk identified him as Dr. George Lomer. Next to him stood a woman. I read Dr. Ilse Anschutz on the name tag on her doctor's coat. There was a terrarium with small black scorpions in a corner of the room. Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2 played softly in the background, and Dr. Anschutz pulled a dictating machine out of her pocket and turned it on. The orderly pushed me onto a chair screwed to the floor and fixed me with foot and handcuffs. He left my arm free. Then he left. A framed poem by Ernst Moritz Arndt from the Napoleonic Wars hung on the wall, and I remembered the Battle of the Nations monument in Leipzig that I had visited. "Has he ever experienced such harmony as that of Shostakovich?" The doctor addressed me with a perfect Boston accent and swung his right hand to the beat of the waltz. "Like the calm in the eye of the hurricane, while outside rages the behemoth that devours everything. A new melody began. The Snowstorm, a waltz by Geordie Sviridoff, Dr. Lomer noted. I shook my head as I was not familiar with this composition. Without looking, I began to quote from the poem on the wall. There is the German's fatherland, where oaths attest the grasped hand, where truth beams from the sparkling eyes, and in the heart love warmly lies. That is the land, all Germany's thy fatherland. How many languages does he speak? Asked Dr. Lomer. Some fluently and some partly. I spoke into the camera that was mounted on the wall behind the doctor. On the back of one of the books stacked on the desk, I read the title, The Genealogy of Morality, and noted, Many have lost their way in Nietzsche. The doctor raised his eyebrow questioningly. Nietzsche's Übermensch is by definition not racially determined, but transcendental, transhuman, not suprahuman, I explained. Not only his understanding of morality confirms this, but it can also be read from his writing, Nietzsche contra Wagner. Dr. Lomer wiped his lenses with a fine cloth and kept silent. He looked, apparently absent-mindedly, at the green desk pad, pushed his glasses back on his nose with pointed fingers, and looked at me. The multiplied radiance of his pale, piercing eyes, as if under a burning glass, hit me abruptly and made me weaken. He is a traveller in the dimensions of the psyche, and travellers, as is well known, should not be stopped. He said with a cold, cutting voice that made me shiver. He wants to prove to me that he is a human being and can think? All I hear is an endless tape loop of stammering quotations. Such methods of self-protection do not reach me because I am intellectually, mentally, and professionally superior to him. He formed his mouth into something that was supposed to look like a smug smile and added, I will torture him. He will not escape, but I will allow him to escape torture if he guesses the composer of the following piece of music. The music began, but I was not familiar with the composition. Well? The doctor wanted to know. I don't know, I replied. I knew, of course, that he is just an obscene, banal creature and could not know it. Lomer laughed scornfully. That is how it is with deluded, self-absorbed and semi-educated cosmopolitan subjects like him, whose understanding of culture is selective and lost in partial details. Wretchedly uncultured, devoid of all loyalty and belonging to no one but the syndicate, the pack. While he was getting excited, saliva spattered from his lips in fine bubbles. His eyes remained fixed on me, then he relaxed. Aram Kachaturian, the masquerade waltz, he exclaimed, almost cheerfully, and swung his right hand again in time with the melody. One of the most beautiful waltzes ever composed. Because of the hopelessness of my situation, I let myself be driven by the sounds. While the doctor in front of me swung his imaginary baton, I did not attempt to mobilize my remaining inner resistance and gave up on myself at this moment. Only once will I make this offer. Dr. Lomer's words jarred me out of my self-forgetfulness. He shall tell me everything, and since he does not know what I want to know, he will tell me every single detail. I opened my eyes and stared at the doctor's grey-haired head, which bent down toward me. His lips secreted drool, covering my face with a fine film of moisture. Otherwise, he will travel into the abyss of the 11 dimensions, and I will ask him no more questions, but will extract everything from his brain as it escapes into madness, he added threateningly. He sat down at his desk and gave Dr. Anschutz a sign. She put the dictation machine on the table. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the water tank, she said and turned to leave. Dr. Anschutz approached me, and I noticed the T-shirt she was wearing under her gown. I noticed the slogan, Save the Dolphins, and caught her gaze. In her cold eyes, I could see the cruelty. She looked more like someone who tortured animals than someone who saved dolphins. I turned my head back to the doctor and asked, Where shall I begin? And I noticed that Dr. Lomer practically never blinked. This is the only decision he is allowed to make here. Dr. Lomer replied. His eyes were blindfolded. Nevertheless, in the total darkness of the vault, he could feel the presence of people. He breathed deeply, in and out. The air soaked with heavy aromas made him stagger slightly. The unsteady crackling of burning candles and torches was the only perceptible sound. His nakedness did not bother him. A well-tempered baritone broke the silence. The endeavour to achieve your own bliss in raptures, faithfulness sealed in the heart, a divine spark, to follow the one who brings the yoke of damnation to those not of him on the right path. The man heard a gong sound behind him and intuitively turned his blindfolded eyes in a southeasterly direction. One who, with Prometheus's fire, transmutes man into gold, who brings the glory of damnation to those not of him. To follow the one, and with a faithful heart seals his divine spark, aiming to reach one's own bliss rapturously on the left path. A second gong sounded from the northwest. Again the man instinctively snapped his head around. Opus magnum, magnum opus. As the last words faded away and silence manifested itself again with the restless crackling of countless small fires, a sudden shiver ran through the naked man. Freezing now, he felt cold sweat running down his back. For agonizingly long moments, he felt utterly lost. We shall begin. A male voice with a distinctly British accent suddenly snatched him out of his paralysis.